it's time that we make right with God, straighten our path, and end the fiscal promiscuity that has plagued our nation and the nations of our allies in Europe and elsewhere. We have been engaged in spending which cannot be justified morally, is certainly not justifiable pragmatically, and that's exactly what Bobby and I are going to be doing today. That's what we're just going to get rid of that. So what we're going to do today is I want to explain the moral principle that we think underlies our belief that the kind of spending that we're engaged in right now is fundamentally unacceptable. Then I'm going to have a very simple structure. I want to explain why it's problematic that we're doing so much deficit spending. I'm going to give you two concrete cases of policies that Bobby and I support. And we think if they don't engage those policies or explain why those are bad things, then they're going to lose the debate. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the benefits of righting our path and getting right with God. Okay, so what's the moral principle? We think the idea that we engage in some kind of social contract, which is fixed temporally, is ridiculous. The only way we conceive of a community in which people are being born and dying all the time is that it's an intergenerational project, which means our moral obligations, even within the society, extend to generations that are coming. That's why politicians talk in very flippant ways about their children and their children's children and their children's children's children all the time, because as the moral foundation of policies which stretch out in the future. Obviously, debt is one of those things, because while we might enjoy deficit spending and its benefits, our children and our children's children will pay the bill. We think that's fundamentally unacceptable if we straddle them with a situation in which they cannot enjoy the kind of society that we have enjoyed. We think that's the moral principle of our point of view. But why do we think deficit spending came about, and why do we think it's problematic? First of all, the cause is basically this, that Western liberal democracies have created robust welfare states, where there are large protections for people who are retired, vulnerable in communities. We think these are generally good things. Unfortunately, we also haven't been procreating very well. So in Western Europe, in the United States especially, in Russia as well, you see a problem of there being not enough people to do the labor for the retiring generation, not enough people to generate the GDP and the revenue necessary to sustain those entitlement programs. This is fundamentally problematic. You look at France and the riots that are occurring right now as they try to move their age from 60 to 62. You look, for example, at the United Kingdom, the austerity measures that they are presenting, and the United States as well having this debate. The impact is that without reining in the deficit spending, you threaten those very programs and their continued viability, and we also would say that you threaten stability within the business environment itself, because it is not entirely clear to businesses who are trying to project 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road in terms of financial investments, what the tax threshold will be, whether or not they can make likely investments, what rate they're going to be taxed at, because they realize they're operating in a politically untenable environment. So the question is only when we will actually take this burden up. Bobby and I say, today is already too late, but today is better than tomorrow. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, it sounds like side proposition is saying there's a moral obligation to not deficit spend in the context of things like pensions, and therefore advocating pension reform. What we ask is that same moral obligation apply when you do have a labor force, but you have chronically unemployed people. Do we end deficit spending then?
Yes, I'm going to say we're going to end it right now, and I'll transition directly into the things that we propose. There are two things that Bobby and I want to do. We don't think this is a final solution. We don't think this will result in a balanced budget. But the two things that Bobby and I support doing with regard to Social Security in the United States, which goes insolvent in 18 months according to the CBO, is that we would move the retirement age, which is currently at 65, to 70. Furthermore, we would make it means tested, meaning if you make over $150,000 a year and already have a lot of retirement money saved up, you would no longer have access to the benefits of Social Security, because we think that's totally superfluous. They don't need those benefits. We think doing those two things would make Social Security solvent into the foreseeable future. That's a good thing. Secondly, we would repeal the dimension of the Bush tax cuts that applies to people that make more than $250,000, families that make more than $250,000 a year. We think to take care of austerity, you need to both have taxation to create revenue, and you need to trim back the entitlement programs that are suffocating the country and suffocating the opportunities of future generations. The reason why we think this is acceptable, particularly in the case of Social Security, is that when it was enacted at the age of 65, the life expectancy of citizens was something like 73. That's now moved up to on average 78. So we think the changing reality, the changing demographics, make it entirely acceptable for us to move this back to 70. There will be some harm as a result of that. Some people who do not want to work will have to work longer. We accept that because we think sacrifice is necessary to not put all of that sacrifice on future generations to whom we have a moral obligation. So those are the policies we think are incredibly prudent, incredibly reasonable, and the only alternative to that is delaying the problem until a more radical proposal comes forward in the future that's politically necessitated by these dynamics. So we think now is the time to act prudentially in ways that can save these entitlement programs. So what are a couple of the benefits that we think accrue by having this kind of policy? There are two. in particular. The first has to deal with business communities. As I mentioned before, and this is precisely the kind of move that we see happening in the United Kingdom under David Cameron, is that he's saying if we want to be a focus of financial success, if we want to have any growth, we can't do it through the Bush policy or the Reagan policy of slashing taxes and regulation, encouraging business in that way. Instead, in this climate of economic recession, of economic uncertainty, the best bet you have is to be the solid bet. Maybe not the bet of highest rate of return, but a solid bet for stability. And that means you create institutional frameworks which are likely to endure going into the future. That means you don't run 5 or 10 years of incredibly unstable processes. That's why they're they're decreasing their benefit structures and they're increasing their revenue structures simultaneously in the way that we would propose could happen in the United States that would be good. Okay, so businesses, in order to make long-term investments which they require, need this kind of stability and continuity in order to make secure investments. Until they do that, they simply are going to avoid making investments. And I'm not just speculating here, it's a fact. In the United States, 1% of the population of the country sits on 90% of its wealth. And right now, there aren't enough jobs because businesses are unwilling to hire people back or unwilling to get massive products to get into their manufacturing bases precisely because they are unsure what the fiscal situation of the United States government will be going forward. For that reason, we have tons of capital which is not being dispersed into the economy. That's the stimulus that we need. We only tap into that stimulus when we create stable conditions under which those investments can prudentially be made by those businesses. Lastly, we think there's an important benefit with regard to vulnerable communities, and I've been alluding to this throughout my speech. And this has to do with the fact that the vulnerable communities, we think, are further endangered insofar as we put off this problem and continue to spend benefiting the current generation, benefiting current retirees, and not taxing businesses now. Because when that day comes, that these institutions are no longer viable in a way that's more disastrous than it is now, we will have much more severe reactions to the political climate in ways which we think would benefit or would be disastrous to people who rely for their existence on government aid. I'm thinking of people who are on disability, for example. I'm thinking of people who require education to have any chance in society because there are no other social frameworks to help them. So we think vulnerable communities need this cutback now so that we can maintain vital programs. We think businesses, in order to invest, need to begin doing this now. We think what we set up is that there's a problem with deficit spending. It's solved by these kinds of models. That's why we're proposed. Thank you.
Thank that speaker for his eloquent remarks. The chair now is happy to recognize the leader of the opposition.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During my speech, I'm going to talk about two things, and then I'm going to go through a rebuttal of what we heard during the first speech. And then during my partner's speech, we'll hear some new matter. He's the MIT guy who knows a lot of math. He's going to talk a little bit about the macroeconomic situation on the ground right now, and why actually increasing our fiscal outlook, increasing our spending, is absolutely essential for the maintenance of our economy. But the two arguments that I want to talk about right now are, first of all, I want to talk about the idea of investment and government spending as an investment in the future. Recognize that there are many essential investments that governments must make all the time. That is, they have to do things like invest in infrastructure so that we have better roads and things like that in the future. We have to invest in things like healthcare so that we have hospitals that aren't crumbling, and so when we have healthcare services, they don't constantly fall in quality. We also have to invest in things like unemployment benefits, because if people have no unemployment benefits, they're just going to take the first job they're offered as opposed to taking the best job they're offered, and we have inefficient results. But this is also true of lowering taxes. When we lower taxes, this is one of the policies that they talked about, we actually create greater incentives for investment by private companies. And even when we're financing it by deficit spending, we're still making an investment in the future of our economy. Why is this the case? Because whenever we borrow, whenever anyone borrows, there's a cost-benefit analysis that takes place. You have to measure the cost of the borrowing versus the benefit that you get from the investment, that is the rate of the return on the investment. And if the cost-benefit analysis is positive, we believe that it's an investment that you should take. If the cost-benefit analysis is negative, it's one that you shouldn't. Why is this particularly important in our current fiscal economic situation? The reason why this is particularly important is because we are currently in a recession, and we are currently in a recession where interest rates are extremely low. That is, currently the Fed funds rate is at 0.25%. It's literally as low as the Federal Reserve is willing to bring down interest rates. Why is this particularly important? The federal funds rate, the general rate of interest rates in the economy, is the cost of borrowing that governments are undertaking. That is, that whenever we deficit spend, either through cutting taxes or spending more money on public investments, the cost of that deficit spending on future generations like they talk about is literally the cost of the interest rate and the cost of servicing that interest rate. So what we would tell you then is that at a time in our history at which interest rates are particularly low is the best time to make those investments because you have a greater potential to have a positive rate of return on those investments because the cost is so low. In fact, because these investments are essential and have to occur at some point, and we have to encourage these investments to occur at some point, you do a greater disservice to future generations if you wait until interest rates are extremely high to make these investments, because then interest rates and interest servicing is compounding on future generations in a way that's far more costly than if we do it when interest rates are particularly low. So that's why we live in a current economic climate when the government ought to be expanding its fiscal outlook, when it ought to be making the investments for the future that we ought to be making right now. These are the types of things that we ought to be doing, and these are the types of things that we ought to be doing for future generations as well. Sure.
So while consumer-based interest rates are relatively low, how would you grapple with the fact that the United States government now has to borrow at an increasingly high interest rate because we have to continuously buy debt?
The cost of the debt is low because the cost of capital is low because interest rates throughout the economy are low. Like, I don't understand. Like, actually, this is actually pretty important for you guys because you have to understand this. The debt markets that exist are the same debt markets. That's why when governments borrow, it does increase the cost of borrowing at some level, right? Which is something that you guys are going to want to claim. But at the same level, like, so that's why it's cheap now to borrow. Like, it's just simply the fact that it's going to be more expensive if we wait and do this later. And like, as I said, these are essential investments. So it's merely a question of whether we do it now or not. And if they care about future generations like they say that we do, we should do it now and not do it later. But the second thing that I want to talk about is the idea that when we have these types of fiscal austerity measures, they hurt the people who are least well off and are least able to achieve political voice of the political system. That is, when governments are looking for what to cut, when governments are looking at where to triage their spending and where to send things, it's the people who have political power who are able to defend their programs. It's people who have special interests who are able to defend their programs. The people who don't have that power and don't have that special interest are less able to defend those programs. So the effect of their government policies when they cut spending and do all these other sorts of things is that they're going to be harming the most vulnerable people in society and not harming the people who they think that they're going to be able to do, that they're going to be able to help. So let's talk a little bit about these arguments that we get from the first proposition. Before I do, go ahead.
Okay, so do you really think it's fundamentally unethical for us to return our retirement structure to the FDR level, considering where the average rate of death is now?
What do you mean by FDR level?
When FDR, the President of the United States, enacted Social Security, when the death level was
So the retirement age was not 65 when Social Security was made. It was like 55, actually. And it has increased over time, so don't let them say that. But secondly, let's talk a little bit about these specific proposals that they make, because I don't think that any of these proposals are actually fiscal austerity measures. So the first thing that they talk about is how they're going to completely overhaul Social Security. None of these things necessarily have any implication on how much money we spend on Social Security, right? If we means test Social Security benefits, that doesn't mean that we're spending less money on Social Security. It just means that the people who get that money in the Social Security Trust Fund are only poor people. Furthermore, they say that we're going to increase the retirement age. Like, yes, at a certain extent, you're going to spend a little bit less money. But we think that they're doing this in a way that contradicts a lot of the principles that they talk about. So first of all, they talk about this idea that current generations can't bind future generations. Well, what about past generations? All the people who have lived up to this point, who are 64 right now, or 63 right now, have been operating under the expectation that when they turn 65, they're going to get Social Security benefits. Now the current generation that's in power is telling them, no, you have to wait 5 more years that they didn't plan for, that they might not be ready for, particularly poor people who don't have the necessary means to fund their retirement unless they're getting Social Security benefits. We're totally violating those people's expectations. We're totally placing a huge burden on those people because of our current generation's needs. We don't think that that's fair. Furthermore, they talk about stability. How are you having a stable economic climate when the government all of a sudden says that we're going to increase the retirement age by 5 years on people who have been planning to have all these personal investment decisions? Recognize that the biggest investors in the U.S. stock market are personal investors. 80% of Americans own some stock in a publicly invested company. What determines those public investment decisions? When they're going to retire. If you're constantly changing the retirement age just like that, you're going to be distorting those economic decisions. That's why we think that if you want to do the things that they talk about, you should at least do them gradually and not just impose them at a time of fiscal crisis. And Peter will talk more about why this will be particularly damaging to our economy. But furthermore, they talk about this idea of the social contract. We think they're just emotionally throwing around ideas about future generations, right? I think that, yes, future generations have to pay the debts that we take out, but they also reap the benefits of the investments that we make. When the economy expands, when the economy is not expanding, when people are actually creating businesses and putting idle machinery into use, which can increase output and increase their quality of living, future generations are helped by that as well. And it's particularly interesting when they talk about procreation. If you want people to have more kids, and you want our population to be younger, don't cut the services that make it possible for people to support their children. Expand them. We are very, very proud of those.
Okay. I thank that speaker very much for his eloquent remarks. And the House is now happy to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue our debate.
Okay, there are a couple of concessions that came out of the last speaker that I think play into the hand of James and I. Two of them. The first being that Social Security is a huge institution that ought to be protected. But the second is that these institutions will go insolvent if we don't take some type of action to prevent that from happening. His alternative is deficit spending. That's what the bulk of my split is going to be about. Why it is that deficit spending is a terrible end to fixing this problem, or a terrible means to fixing this problem. Before I get into that, I want to get into some refutation, then I want to rebuttress my partner's points. Okay. So what we heard on the last speaker in terms of positive matter was that investment gets stifled, right? But this is predicated upon a different understanding of the model. You have to engage with us on the social security argument, right? We're not saying that we're going to be getting rid of other forms of welfare programs. We're not getting rid of all social programs. We're making drastic cuts and drastic changes to the way in which Social Security in and of itself functions. That is the debate we are wanting to operate under. We aren't going to be proposing cuts to hospitals. That's not what we're doing. We're not cutting the police force. Sure, you can put up a bunch of different examples as to why those things might be bad, but this is the model that we set forth today. Then he tells us that interest rates are interesting for people, right? That they should be able to borrow at low rates. But he doesn't grapple with my POI at all. At the point at which I tell you that certainly the United States has to borrow at a higher level than do citizens within the country, he tells us no, they borrow at the same rate. That isn't true. China sets the rate at which we borrow money from them, at the point at which we have to borrow money from those institutions. We have to bite the bullet as the American government at the difference that we see, right? So if China's going to let us borrow at 8% interest and we lend it out at 0% interest, that literally just compounds the debt that we have. That seems to be problematic. And no, that's a fact. Okay. Then the last thing that he tells us is that political power is a means of protecting the institutions that we want to see protected. This is seemingly ridiculous, right? What we would say is that we're cutting institutions for people that don't necessarily need the protection. Bush tax cuts going to people who make $250,000 a year or more. These aren't people who are poor. These aren't people that are starving. These aren't people that can't protect themselves. We are cutting the money from people who don't need it. But second, we would say that we're cutting the benefits on a means-tested basis, which means that if you don't qualify for the Bush tax cuts and you are making like $150,000 a year, we're going to cut it for you as well because we think you can protect yourself. That's what we think the state. That's the bright line that we set for the state. The only argument that he really grapples with is James's moral principle. Because what he says is that our moral principle is inconsistent and that we don't protect the individuals who are like 65 now. I'll take you at the end of this. That we don't protect the individuals who are like 65 or 64 now. And we have to bite the bullet on this one. We are sort of giving it to them, right? But the point is that we are doing so as a means of protecting a far greater number of individuals in the long run. If Social Security is so important that we ought to protect it, if it protects so many individuals from going bankrupt and not being able to pay for health services later on down the road, then we certainly think we ought to screw over 100,000 people in protection of the 150 million people that are going to need those services later on down the road. That's what we think ought to be done. And then he tells us that investments are going to get affected by this because we are frivolously changing the way in which this operates, or Social Security operates all the time. No, we're saying that we're facing a really tough time right now and that we need to shift it right now, and that later on we may shift it back down, right? But the point is that now is a functional, it's a fork in the road. We need to make a decision now, and this is the place that we need to make it. Go ahead, JJ.
Yeah, it's funny, Mr. Speaker, that now the second speaker says they're not cutting all deficit spending just up like Social Security. When I clearly asked James the question, he said, no, it's all over. And they finance it through this Bush tax cut that can only finance the federal deficit for about a week.
No, we support the principle of austerity cuts. What we don't support is ridiculous cuts to things like what we heard of the LO, like we're going to cut hospital spending, or we're going to cut police force spending. That's not at all what we're advocating. We're advocating cutting frivolous spending in places like pension programs, in places like benefit programs like welfare, right? Okay, positive matter. I want to talk about what ends up happening at the point at which you deficit spend. And we're going to use the United States as a case study, if you will, because what we say is that in going into further debt, which is what's advocated by the leader of the opposition, we become less financially independent. We literally need to sell our debt and borrow money at higher interest rates as a means of becoming solvent. If you believe that Social Security, which is what the LO concedes, is something that ought to be protected, then you literally need to spend more money in order to protect those things. Over the long run, this accrues more debt. We need to borrow more money, which means we need to sell more treasury bonds to countries like China, who are the only countries who have the means to buy that debt in the first place. Why is that bad? Well, we would say that China there are three impacts that occur, right? First, China already has a $2 trillion surplus in U.S. currency reserves. This is problematic, right? We would say that if they dump them, that means that we become economically unviable. So at the point at which China says, we're not happy with you, we're going to dump all of your money, this functionally destroys the economy of the United States. We are no longer able to function. Second, we would say that in having currency reserves, they're able to manipulate their currency and our own currency as a means of making their exports cheaper and making our exports more expensive. This is problematic because it affects us on an international level and a domestic level. This has ripple effects in which all countries need to manipulate their currency to be competitive with countries like China, who export things at such cheap levels that they're literally pushing out competition. But what's problematic on a domestic level is that now the United States unemployment gets affected at the point at which we aren't able to compete with them on a manufacturing and export level. That means that the economy continues to struggle, people that are unemployed continue to stay unemployed, and we aren't able to get the progress in the economy that we wish to see on both sides of the house. But the third thing that we would say is that our interest rates go up at the point at which our economy proves to be more of a risk to invest in than a reward, right? So the point at which countries like China are no longer going to say, you know what, it's a really safe bet to invest in the economy, they're going to increase the interest rates. They're going to increase the amount at which we're going to need to borrow. That compounds our debt even more at the point at which we need to spend more and more money to bail out the Social Security programs that they say are so important in the status quo. We rely on our economic might in Western liberal democracies, most specifically in the United States, as a means of economic and international political power. At the point at which we cede our economic might, we are ceding our ability to be functional powerhouses in the international community. We aren't able to buy things like the weapons that make us so powerful and you act as soft power in the international sphere. But what's more important is we aren't able to do things like we have to tread water with countries like China, who we want to see progress with on things like, I don't know, human rights violations. We can't use our moral vanguard in the way that we ought to be using it to influence politics in the international sphere because we need to worry about our own asses and our nuts in the vice, if you will. Pardon my expletives, okay? So the point is if you allow them to continuously buy debt, you make us less powerful on an international level for those reasons.
I thank that speaker for his remarks, and the House is happy to recognize the deputy leader of the opposition. Hear, hear!
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to start out with some refutation of what we on the side opposition see as some really poor economic understanding that comes from this side of the House. And then I'm going to move into more new material on how exactly the government should behave during a recession, what sort of policies we need to use to get out of the economic condition. So first of all, we get a little bit of a response from them, which they say that they try to cop out of Alex's analysis about how this is going to hurt the economy by saying they're not reducing all this government spending, they're just raising the age at which Social Security benefits can be given out. Realize that that's exactly what they're doing, right? At the point where they say that they're not going to be giving Social Security benefits out to a whole bunch of people who would otherwise receive them, and particularly poor people who receive the majority of Social Security benefits, which are being tested, you think that they're necessarily reducing liquidity and the potential spending that could come from these people. So don't let them try and tell you we're just changing the age, because at the point where they're meeting the resolution at all, they're reducing the amount of spending the government's putting into the economy, they're reducing the amount of liquidity and the amount of response that these people can give. So the next argument that we get from him is kind of a misunderstanding of interest rates. And he tries to tell us, like, after all of Alex's analysis about how this is the time for the government to invest, this is the time when interest rates are low for the government to take action, he says, no, the interest rates aren't low for the government and they're just low for everybody else. He kind of imagines an arbitrage condition that just could never exist in the real world, right? If it were the case that the government had to pay ridiculous prices for its debt, then they would no longer sell debt to China, right? They would sell debt to somebody else. They would sell debt to other people. Arbitrage conditions like that disappear instantaneously because they don't exist in the real world because of the way simple economics works. And this is like the kind of misunderstanding you see throughout their analysis. So then the other thing they try to respond to, that Alex tells you that they really don't get any good response to, is this idea of radical changes. Like, we tell you that you want to be political, and this is something that they hold as beneficial as well. They say that people need to be able to understand what's happening in order to be confident, in order for there to be consumer confidence. What Alex tells you is that, yes, we respect Social Security as an institution. We think good things, we need to do something about Social Security. But the answer there should never be immediately, right now, say that we're going to raise the age by 5 years when all of these people have been planning to retire at a particular age, right? What does that do? When you make radical changes like that and a shock in what people have expected for their future, you're only going to increase the amount that they're going to want to be saving by ridiculous amounts. Right now, they're probably going to increase savings irrationally because they're scared of the amount that the government is going to reduce their ability to receive Social Security benefits in the future. And this bites in exactly to all of the arguments that we make about how there's not going to be consumer confidence, there's not going to be any spending. You take away the potential for there to be any sort of economic recovery whatsoever. We think they even grant this further by saying, look, we need to do this now, we need to save Social Security, maybe later we'll put the age back down again. This is kind of conceding that their policy is to want to just kind of change the age up and down as if it's something that they can modulate in order to fix economic problems. What we tell you is this is a long-term institution whose stability is extremely important for how people choose to make investments, how people choose to spend money. This kind of policy is simply abusive.
Okay, but so if your counterprop is, yes, we agree with you, but let's do it over a 5-year graduated period, that's not exactly a principled opposition.
Okay, so our counterprop is, first of all, it's a principled opposition to not doing your plan, right? Like, the idea that you have just simply saying change by 5 years right now is a bad idea. But moreover, we give you the idea that the reason we should not be engaging in fiscal austerity is because we have economic problems right now. This is not the time to turn around and try to solve Social Security. This is the time to fix the recession. This is the time to get ourselves out of these problems and do that later. So let's talk exactly about that, because this is kind of actually, hold on, one more bit of refutation. They try and add in their new material in this last speech is that China has a lot of our debt, and unless we solve this immediately, China's just going to be able to end us, they're going to start reigning in debt. This is one of my least favorite fallacies that people make all the time, and they make this argument that China is going to destroy us. If China destroyed us, China would end, right? The economy is about everything. If China ended the United States, they would have no way to function in the global market. The idea that we're at risk simply from being in debt to them is just a complete misunderstanding of economics. So let's talk about what we should do when we're in a recession. So we are in a recession. At the point where we understand that the Fed has refused to raise interest rates from this 0.25%, which they've been at for a while now, we understand that these people, the Federal Reserve, recognize that we're in a difficult condition. So at the point where we recognize that, we believe these people would probably know a little something about the economy, maybe. We think that there are measures that we should be taking in order to fix these problems. Now, we've proven by the fact that the interest rates are so low that they are essentially zero, that monetary measures can no longer be the course of action that we take. There's no room left to take monetary measures and monetary expansion in order to help the economy. This means the only thing that we can do in order to try solve this problem is fiscal expansion. The only thing that we can do in order to increase consumer confidence is to spend money to create demand for consumer products, to create demand for these companies that they talk about who aren't providing jobs to actually use their equipment, use the investments that they've made, and actually respond to the demand that exists that the government needs to create. So what happens if we don't do this? If we don't take action now, or at least remain at the level of fiscal expansion that we have, if we allow for them to decrease the amount of fiscal policy that we're using right now. If we don't do that, we end up in a really poor and a really worrisome condition that we call it a deflationary spiral. So here's the problem that we exist in right now. The government has been using monetary policy to try and solve this problem for a while now, and monetary policy's benefits have been exhausted. And unfortunately, people are not responding completely rationally to monetary policy changes because they're extremely worried about the fact that we're in a recession and they don't want to spend money. So at the point where they're not spending money here, at the point where the normal consumer is not willing to increase the demand that exists in the economy, prices are continuing to fall. As prices continue to fall, we see real deflation. At the point where there is real deflation, these people are worth even less and even less willing to spend in the future. So what action can we take to correct this? The government can inject that demand in the economy. The government can be the one who is willing to spend. The government can engage in fiscal expansion. If there's ever a time for fiscal expansion, it is at this time when we have exhausted all monetary options, but we still find ourselves in a recession. There are arguments about how we can't leave this moral problem for the future, and just being in a deficit in and of itself is somehow an inherently bad thing, or just a misunderstanding of economics in general. What we tell you is that we need to correct this problem. The fact that we're in a deficit is something that can be corrected once we've gotten ourselves out of a recession. We think that everything that they do, shocking the retirement age, cutting down on the expendable income of some of the people who are making more in the economy, is something that cannot happen in the situation that our economy is in right now. And for all these reasons, we're very proud of those.
I thank that speaker for his remarks. And the chair is now pleased to recognize the member of government.
I must spread my ill next across the table. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen a lot of debate about the policies of the United States. That's really unfortunate for us as a Canadian team. But we're fortunate enough that we come from a country that undertook exactly the actions that they're proposing on-site government and is stronger for having done so. I'm going to bring forward 3 lines of extension for you today. First, I'm going to elaborate on their moral things and say their moral principles and say why it's never permissible for a government to steal the labor of those who will come after us. Secondly, I'm going to talk about moral hazard and how you actually, the only way to prevent further recessions and further catastrophes of the type they oppose to is to actually feel a bit of economic pain and then use that as a motivation for restructuring your financial system. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little briefly about Canada. So first of all, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this moral principle, because we hear about a social contract from first proposition. We're going to ask very quickly, what happens when a country runs a deficit? Because what we say, and it's quite obvious if you think about it, is you're taking money and guaranteeing it against the labor of others. We think that's absolutely impossible for a government to do so, because you're essentially stealing the labor of those who will come after you. We think that's absolutely unacceptable. We think that they talk briefly about what about past generations who had these same sorts of benefit, who are going to have their benefits robbed. We think there's a huge difference between past generations and current generations, in that past generations are represented within our political system. They at least had the opportunity to go, whoa, we're going down a bad road. Future generations haven't had that problem. That's a big issue on our side of the house. Alright, so let's talk about this notion of moral hazard. Because we think that the idea that the world is in a recession is something that doesn't exist independently of the people who live within the economy. It was largely due to the consumer tendencies of the American consumer themselves that they experienced this sort of recession that they're currently in. We think that unless they feel consequences brought on by that recession, things like having their social security cut, having perhaps increased taxes, the policies brought forward by first proposition, there becomes no incentive to actually undertake reformations of the financial system. We would point to Canada, and this is the small Canada example, which had a much more tightly regulated financial system and had much lower rates of recession when the economy went into collapse. And it's an example of the type of thing you can actually do in the economy to prevent further things. Lastly, let's talk about Canada. Because as we've said, we are disadvantaged in this manner, we're not American. But we come from a country that actually undertook these economic problems. In the 1990s, Canada had gigantic rates of federal debt. Our cost to service the debt was astronomical, and it meant that we had fewer options in terms of social spending. We had fewer ways that we could express our will politically in terms of spending. We think that was a huge problem. And we went and we actually took significant cuts to social security. We raised the age for Canadian pension plans. We significantly we added a sales tax on all goods sold within Canada. And the result of that was that our deficit went down dramatically. It's a much lower percentage of debt than it currently exists within the US. What does that mean for Canada? It means we have more options. It means that we're able to undertake social spending that would be impossible under the sort of model, under the sort of system that the United States exists within. It means that actually domestic spending and investment and employment do considerably better within Canada because they're not under the constant fear that the government is going to either increase inflationary policies or simply default on their debt. So that actually increases investment within Canada as well. It makes everyone better off because of the short-term pain that we experience. We think that's very important. So let's move over to what opposition said. Actually, I'll take you.
So you say that if we raise taxes and decrease spending, that will decrease the deficit. But if the economy spirals into a terrible recession that continues, where are going to be the productive businesses paying taxes that are going to pay any of the government spending?
All right, that was actually interesting. Because what they tell us is that only through spending money can we ever hope for the economy to come out of the recession. Well, the wonderful thing about economics is that eventually it finds equilibrium. Under their side of the house, perhaps there are less immediate costs to that. But we say, as I've said in my constructive analysis, sometimes costs are beneficial in terms of further regulation of the economy. Moreover, we say that under their side of the house, you actually prevent the long-term restoration of the economy that you're going to see under our side of the house. This is a new line of refutation. I'm going to bring forward the idea of how government spending actually interferes with a private reconstruction. Because, for instance, what we say is in many cases the government competes for capital within the system. That's a problem. We say that in many cases it provides short-term labor for individuals who might otherwise accept low-paying jobs that will ultimately increase real wealth within the society. Lastly, we'd say that the existence of government debt makes it more difficult for a business to make economic decisions because they're not sure what sort of economic policies the United States or any other country is going to take. If you don't know whether there's going to be gigantic amounts of inflation within your country, because you don't know whether they're going to be able to pay their bond debts, we think it's very difficult for you to choose, hey, am I going to increase production, am I going to build a factory? It becomes impossible to actually make new investment. Why is that important? Because the type of employment they provide under their model is short-term and temporary. It's difficult for an individual to make decisions based on, I can build a road for 6 months, then what? So actual meaningful economic reconstruction can only happen from private investment. And that can only happen when they have a notion of what the government is going to be able to do. That can only happen when the bond markets have been reassured that the government is making meaningful strides towards paying off their debts. Some interesting things that are the less important things they talk about. They say there's only one interest rate. That's absolutely false. Interest rate is also a notion of risk within the economy. Obviously, if you say the government might not be able to pay off their debt, you're going to demand a higher interest rate from them. We think that the government bonds are on the verge of being degraded, which would dramatically increase the cost of servicing them within the economy. That notion of interest rates is largely based off lies. They talk about a cost-benefit analysis. We say that it's a cost-benefit analysis that you can't make on behalf of others. We think that we stand on our moral principles that you can't steal the labor of those who have yet to come, who have no say in the economic system. We're proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for his remarks. We welcome the representative of the final team to continue our debate.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the point at which we prove that deficit spending in the status quo actually improves the economy, improves the infrastructure, and makes us better able to remove our debt to future generations is the point at which we on opposition will necessarily win on government's own criteria, right? But first I'm going to engage in a little bit of rebuttal and then I'm going to talk to you, Mr. Speaker, about the specific policies given to us by government bench, and then I'm going to talk to you, Mr. Speaker, about why we think that we do prove that deficit spending is necessarily better for future generations. Okay, from the last speaker we hear number one, moral principles. It's never permissible to steal the labor of those who come after us. However, it's okay somehow to steal the labor of those who came before us, because they say, wait, these individuals have a political voice. Mr. Speaker, if this were true, if these individuals did have a political voice that was meaningful, we would say this measure simply would not pass them because these individuals are being harmed, right? At which point they don't have a meaningful political voice. His next example, Mr. Speaker, is he says, I'm going to talk about Canada where we did it. One, he certainly did not raise the age of retirement to 70, he raised it to 62, which is the status quo in the United States. Two, nor did you do the second plank of the plan, which is removing previously provided tax cuts. And three, Mr. Speaker, finally, talking about Canada as an austerity-based state is ridiculous, given that it is fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, a non-austere, socialist-based, spending-based government. Like, we just think that that is silly if you're going to use that as an example. Finally, the existence of government debt makes it impossible for businesses to operate. First of all, we think this is empirically false, Mr. Speaker. Second, it seems almost like they're saying on side government that any economic contract shift is necessarily bad. So perhaps the contract shift in terms of changing the retirement age or removing tax cuts, that these businesses made this contract with the government under these conditions would be bad. We think that you necessarily contradict your own case. Then, Mr. Speaker, we think that we hear at the top of the House, like some significant fallacies. Social Security is not an issue of austerity or deficit spending. Tax cuts are, but for the sake of the debate, we'll ignore the resolution and deal with the specifics. Like 70, at what point has nobody in this debate talked about the fact that we're changing the age of retirement to 70? Mr. Speaker, in what world is this efficient, particularly given ageism under the status quo and the inability of individuals over the age of 35 to find a job? We think that you don't solve any harms, in fact, you exacerbate them. Let's look at the two policies, extending the age of Social Security requirement. First of all, it's an economic myth that Social Security is insolvent, especially with this 18-month plan, right? There's a huge reserve held by the government, which while we are moving toward a public and private mixed system, it still relies heavily on vast public reserves, right? When the first government tells us the social contract is predicated upon moral obligation to other generations, to work for your life, Mr. Speaker, and pay taxes in, and then to remove that is not only unfair, but it is literally a contractual violation, right? We think that the impact of this is that even the most libertarian of governments recognize the fundamental requirement of governments to uphold contractual requirements. But then, Mr. Speaker, we hear this issue about the Bush tax cuts, right? Nobody has properly dealt with, Mr. Speaker, the issue of what the Bush tax cuts actually do. It allows for 7 tax brackets at 10, 15, 18, 25, 28, 33, and 35%. Now, the percents aren't what matter, but the issue that we have 7 instead of 5 tax brackets do matter. More specific taxation, Mr. Speaker, means that we more properly assess graduated income levels. This means we better protect the poor. This is very important, Mr. Speaker, because studies show that 70% of the richest wealth are dependent upon infrastructure that the state provides that these individuals have access to. Bush tax cuts phase out, one second, Kilcup. Bush tax cuts phase out itemized deductions, Mr. Speaker, which only impacts Americans who make over $170,000 a year. Without extending the tax cuts, the poor literally shoulder more of the burden, right? So any of the harms that they have about it's unfair to differentially shoulder burdens on future generations, we would say the same sort of impacts apply to the poor. Go.
Okay, the only thing we did was make the tax cuts more progressive, but you're going to explain to me why the 3 major stimulative efforts have failed in the United States and why doing the same thing again will work.
Okay, I'm going to talk about stimulus. Okay, I'll talk about stimulus in my more substantive matter later. We would say the point at which you say we're not going to change the Bush tax cuts, we're only going to extend as part of the Bush taxes. It's the point at which you are not upholding a resolution, which is about austerity measures. Fundamentally, you have to demonstrate to us, as you tell us morally, that we cannot deficit spend, right? At that point, either you say we can deficit spend, and therefore we are going to allow these tax cuts to extend in a certain way, or you're saying that we cannot deficit spend, in which case you have fallen on the opposition side of the house, right? We think that they don't deal with this. First, government is so worried about international impacts, Mr. Speaker, but when the tax divide goes from 15% to 39.6%, which is what happens under their model at the top 2% level, investors won't invest in America, but only overseas. We think this exacerbates all of the Chinese harms that they offer, right? Like, we think this is necessarily bad. So, the point at which we prove that deficit spending in the status quo, Mr. Speaker, actually improves the economy, improves infrastructure, and makes us better able to remove our debt for future generations, we win on God's own criteria. We think that the multiplier effect of deficit spending necessarily means that non-austerity measures do this, right? We start projects with deficit spending, Mr. Speaker, with non-austerity measures that create jobs, especially in terms of infrastructure. This is important, Mr. Speaker, because of the multiplier effect. So on the most fundamental level, when the government spends to create jobs, right, what is the bang for the buck? The government creates a highway. That is direct spending. Secondary levels of spending, those who supply the supplies. Then we have a tertiary level of spending, right, the service industry that supplies support, and the result of spending from the primary and secondary actors. We think that multiplier effect means we get the best bang for our buck when we apply non-austerity measures, Mr. Speaker. In the 1990s, Japan spent $1.4 trillion on infrastructure. The main purpose was to propagate aggregate demand. They succeeded in doing so and brought about economic recovery. California in the 1960s, Pat Brown did the same thing, Mr. Speaker. History shows us that governments run deficits during bad years and they offset them during good years, right? Expansionary fiscal policies should be used in a way that most increase consumer spending. We think we do that on this side of the house, right? This is particularly important right now because without spending, the government loses productivity and recovery time. The economy takes too long to self-correct. The government needs to relieve strain on the populace right now. So look, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, because we don't think that half of their case is even resolutional in the first place, doesn't deal with austerity measures, because, Mr. Speaker, we don't think they properly assessed what is important about the tax cuts that we're actually talking about under the status quo. And because, Mr. Speaker, we think that the only thing we get out of second government is a non-analogous situation that cannot be properly applied to the status quo, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for her eloquent remarks, and the chair is now happy to recognize the final speaker of the government bench, the government whip.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll start by saying for an art student, econ rounds are wicked boring, but there's three questions I think second prop is going to use to address this round today. And the first was, is private investment encouraged by government investment? And what does government investment actually do and serve to harm? The second question is, why is Canada way pimped? And why do they not understand that on second opposition? And the third thing we're going to talk about is ultimately what prevents future recessions, something like a huge leg of our extension that was just opted not to deal with by second opposition. So the first thing is private investment encouraged by government investment? We're going to argue, Mr. Speaker, that ultimately when you use your left hand to feed your right hand to put food in your fat ass, reasonably speaking, you're not actually stimulating the economy in a meaningful way. If people have temporary 6-month jobs, they're not going to be investing into the economy. They're not going to be buying a house. They're not going to be immediately contributing to innovation. They're going to recognize this is a temporary job and a temporary satisfaction, a temporary solution, and we're not going to see the job multiplier that second opposition and second oponomics generally has proposed and invented that we're going to actually see. We ultimately believe that what really is going to drive things, and what's really going to move the economy forward, not right now, what's really going to improve the situation within the government is ultimately the idea of private investment. Because private investment offers long-term solutions and the idea of long-term confidence, both investor confidence, consumer confidence, and ultimately market confidence. And we see this only and exclusively comes from a government that enhances austerity measures. And they pretended Canada's not a good example of this because of this Tea Party craziness that Canada's a socialist country, when every party in Canada except for one, who is largely mocked, is actually denounced socialism in a large way. What we saw in the 1990s, that second economics, I guess, forgot, is only the idea that we raise taxes massively, cut more to the provinces, what America has been unable to do to its own states, by the way, and Canada ultimately enhanced these exact austerity measures. That's first prop, and the second prop is used as an excellent case study in which to show how has Canada succeeded and been afforded by this. We only had 2 quarters of negative growth during the recession. We had massive successes in our import and export markets. We had massive consumer confidence. We had huge levels of innovation that America didn't see because of the exact austerity measures that are being talked about in the prop today. We see when you have government investment, like the American stimulus and the ultimately small and rather useless Canadian stimulus, what you see in these cases is temporary solutions to problems that can be fixed by the invisible hand bitch-slapping the market. What you see is private investment is the much more reasonable way and the much more long-term solutions to the problems we've seen. I'll talk about it. I'll take it.
explain to me how you're going to increase private investment by increasing the taxes on the people in our economy who invest all of the money.
Look, this is exclusively to reduce debt, but what first opposition has offered you is the idea that government bonds are valueless because you don't know where the government's going to be in 10 years, you don't know how long recession is going to last, and you don't know where the debt levels are going to be, where your monetary currency levels are going to be, and what investment is going to actually look like. So what you see is when investors have zero confidence the government is going to be able to repay bonds, repay loans, then they're not going to want to invest in your country, you're not going to see any direct foreign investment, you're not going to see any meaningful growth and innovation within your country if you have exclusively government stimulus. It's this private confidence that creates a long-term solution that we've seen largely ignored by opposition today. I'll take you once more quickly.
Are you really saying that people are worrying about whether there's going to be a U.S. government in 5 years or 10 years? That's the reason why these interest rates are going to be so high?
Obviously the country's going to exist. Will they be able to repay any loans of any kind? Will they be able to have bonds of any kind? Will they be able to have actually any monetary solvency in the future? This is ultimately what we're talking about. And people don't believe that this is going to exist. We're going to see these massive problems of an inability to have private investing and an inability to actually create innovation in a way that we feel will be successful on second prop today. The second thing I'm going to talk about is why Canada actually worked in this way and why second prop pretended it wasn't analogous, but it's actually using the exact methods that first prop talked about. But true, with the age change in a different way than second prop would like you to say. But at the same time, we raised retirement age, we raised taxes, and we changed things in the exact same method, but to a different degree, as first prop talked about. So meaningfully speaking, we saw all the successes of this through changing our banking regulatory system and making things more austere, and creating ultimately a more conservative fiscal spending structure and a much less consumer-based society and a more investor-based society. And Canada has reaped the benefits of this. Ultimately, in the last 2 years, Canada has come out strongest as an investor and leading fiscal policy in the world. In the G20, it was ultimately Canada's discussion of reducing debt largely by 2015 that 19 out of 20 countries agreed on. And the only reason Japan didn't agree is because they can't, because they're simply too broke because of the exact things that opposition has said we should do, which is massive government spending and massive government stimulus. So you see this Canada is actually the most analogous, I'll get you in 1 second, sorry. Well, it's actually the most analogous and most reasonable opposition we can present. I think it's really swell that we're the only Canadians in an otherwise Yankee round, to be able to show that we are the leaders in fiscal policy and the leaders in monetary policy, and it has been remarkably successful back.
The point at which I talked to you about how our policies in California weren't necessarily correct the deficit in the long term. How is California not more analogous to the debate round about the United States than Canada, socialist or not?
Come on, it's not actually just about the United States, it's about global fiscal policy. You can pretend it isn't for this round. But reasonably speaking, we think the way a country operates its fiscal policy more than one of its provinces or states is a much more reasonable way to show how, in a large run, we increase private investorship. And we think that way we can use another country within the G20, Canada, to make a really analogous situation for how austerity has been successful in this way. The last thing I'm talking about is what prevents future recessions. And this is the leg, my partner's extension, that was ultimately completely ignored by second opposition, we think to their detriment. My partner talked about how feeling some sort of level of pain from a recession, how the general populace can feel some sort of hurt, meaningful hurt from a recession, that their taxes raised, they have less availability of liquid funds, they have less ability to actually do things, but more confidence in their government. We think at this point, necessarily, you have to have a greater discussion about why you ought not have recessions in the future, and why you ought to curb spending on an individual level so you continue to curb it on a government level. We think at this point, this is really meaningfully how you can create a dialogue that limits spending in the future. I think this is the most extensive and meaningful way you can actually do that. We think when you have the moral hazard, not understanding what it's like to actually go through a period of recession, and you're passing it off onto your children. You're passing it off onto those whose labor you're borrowing against. We think at that point, you simply don't understand the damage you're doing to future generations. We think if we fix this problem now, because keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, everyone in the round has agreed that we eventually have to deal with debt. Opposition just told you, look, we'll do it when we're in a slightly better position. What is it, Mr. Speaker? Now when we have the ability to allow private investing to actually increase, we have the ability to give more confidence in government. We think at this point, this is the best time to do so. We can prevent future recessions. We can increase private investorship, and we can look to the example of Canada to cure America's ills, as we should have been doing all along. Thank you very much.
I thank that speaker very much for his remarks and invite the final speaker of the round to close out the debate.
Mr. Speaker, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad that the last speaker thought so highly of his partner's extension, if that's what you want to call it. But I think speaking for 14 minutes about why the recession in the future is bad doesn't prove that they actually get the private investment that they say is good and are actually going to thwart those recessions. Instead, what we heard from the previous speaker is out on one side of his mouth, he said, we defend the precise austerity measures that were given to you by the top of side proposition. But then from the other side of his mouth, we heard, no, we don't actually defend tax cuts like they defended at the top of side prop by extending Bush. But instead, in Canada, we seriously hiked taxes in a major way so that we could spur that sort of investment and so forth. So notwithstanding the knife, Mr. Speaker, either A, you believe the top of side proposition, which is a tax cut-based policy, which Emily talked to you about, is actually going to lead to stopping this economic recession, or B, you buy the back half, which is an increase substantially in those tax hikes, is going to lead to that. We think there's a bit of a contradiction. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask you 3 quick questions, not just yet, about today's debate. First, what is moral, right? Who captures the morality point, Mr. Speaker, and what is government morally obligated to do? Second, I want to clarify how bond markets actually function and ask the question, what makes the economy actually stronger? And finally, we think a question that's been sort of missed in the debate, especially when Emily's extension was largely ignored, what is in the best interest of those who are the most likely to be harmed by economic downturn, Mr. Speaker? But let's start with this morality point, because all we hear from side prop, Mr. Speaker, is a lot about how it is absolutely immoral to steal from the labor of tomorrow in order to help people today. And we would say when you raise the retirement age, Mr. Speaker, especially in as egregious of a manner as 70, it's fairly problematic for a couple of reasons. A, these are people who've invested in the system substantially, and so you're stealing from the labor of yesterday, if you will, and we think that has a moral problem as well. But second, Mr. Speaker, the way that pension programs usually function is you have the retirement age, and then you have a graduated system until you eventually qualify for full pension benefits. So the French program, for example, isn't just a hike to 65, it's a hike to 65 for retirement, and then a hike to 67, for example, in order to get full pension benefits. So we think it's a perpetual sort of robbery, if you will. But moreover, when they don't engage in the job creation that Emily talks to you about being important, then you have our largest sort of group of unemployed, the aging unemployed, not only unemployed, but unable to get the government benefits that buffers that very unemployment. We think letting them sort of die as they age without that sort of money to spend is really where the moral question falls on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. No thanks. But I want to get to the second question, which is what actually makes the most economic sense. And we've heard a lot in today's debate about how bond market functions. And I think just to bring it all together, we have to clarify that there were really 2 types of bonds we've talked about, right? There were those pre-existing ones, the ones we sold yesterday, and those that sort of the top half talked to you about a bit, those that we put out more because we have a low interest rate, and consequently, it's a good time for investment. Well, how were those related together? The reality is, Mr. Speaker, when we put out a bond in the status quo with a low interest rate, because interest rates are inversely proportional to past bond value, the previous bond value goes up because they have a fixed rate, not a floating rate. And the consequences are, Mr. Speaker, that they begin to flow again in the capital markets, rise the value of currency, and spur that sort of investment. But second, Mr. Speaker, because we also have the low interest rates in the status quo, we get 2 impacts. Number 1, we don't necessarily sell all of our treasury bonds to places like China. We spur that investment domestically because when our own consumers understand that our economy is in a bad situation, they need a safe investment, which is why they buy treasury bonds, fixed interest rates, Mr. Speaker, that aren't subject to those sorts of market fluctuations. No thanks. So against that backdrop, what we would say is this policy on this side of the House ultimately leads to an increase in those capital markets, which is going to help our currency. Go ahead.
Why don't you tell us why it's acceptable to steal the labor of those who come before us and not deflect it with talk about those from the past?
I'm not sure that we're stealing the labor of those who came before us, Mr. Speaker, because it's a reciprocal relationship, right? There were 2 responses. Number 1, everybody who retires and opts into the system is going to be able to get the benefit, right? So it's an ongoing process. They, on this side of the House, rely on this myth that it's just this one group who are stealing from these people who did it this one time, as opposed to it being no thank you, an ongoing relationship. But second, for all of the previous speakers talk about what Emily didn't say, he conveniently ignored the Social Security analysis she gave you, which is that we're gradually moving towards a two-tiered system on multiple levels, right? The first level of the two-tiered system, well, I guess there could only be two levels of a two-tiered system, but the first discussion of the two-tiered system, Mr. Speaker, is as we gradually privatize, we have these huge private reserves that we can take advantage of, and the problem is that we don't want to, right? What we would say on this side of the house is so invest them in the actual markets, fully privatize so it can survive. But second, Mr. Speaker, now metropolitan areas like Los Angeles are experimenting with a new two-tiered system where we still deficit spend, we allow those who opted into the system early, who we have a contractual obligation to benefit, and then we change it for those after the fact who start working today. No thank you. So what we would say is the system can work, Mr. Speaker. Emily told you that, and they didn't respond. Let's get to the last question, but first, James.
Okay, right now, we have stimulus spending, we have low interest rates, and the economy sucks. There's a lot of capital that's not being used by private markets. Explain to me why they're sitting on it if it's not for the good
Yeah, I
security
hate to
of
sound
public.
like President Obama here, Mr. Speaker, and it is about a little more than hope, right? But we do think that stimulus has a long-term sort of return, and that's why Emily asked the last question, what's in the best interest of those most affected? That's why she talked to you about multiplier yield. When you invest in infrastructural development, you create direct jobs. Those are the individuals who are immediately employed to do things like all that annoying construction in New Haven on the way here from our hotels. But B, you get the indirect jobs, those people who are working to create the supplies. And 3, those service jobs. But more importantly, when you do it like our stimulus package, which invests in new technologies like health IT and so forth, then the end result, Mr. Speaker, is that you have a higher yield of employment with long-term sustainability because you're creating new infrastructures and new jobs. So at the end of the day, what we would say is first, yes, there is a morality point in this debate, but it's not stealing from the people of the past. It's an ongoing issue, and we've talked to you about Social Security. Second, our analysis is what is actually how bond markets function, and it's best for the economy. And third, it's best for those people, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker rather, I break gender binaries, who are actually going to be hurt by the economic discussion.
Thank you all very much. I invite speakers to shake hands, and for the judges, we'll go up and find the room section.